It's almost like he's really good at investing in lifestyle businesses to be, supportive of the companies. Which, don't get me wrong, is totally fine. But I have this like red flag in my mind of whether or not he's going to be able to generate real cash return. All right, I hope you're as excited as I am for today's video. Today, we're going to dive into Robert Herjave's portfolio as a shark on Shark Tank and assess how good of an investor is he really. And, having done this with a bunch of the other sharks, I think you'll be surprised like I was on Robert's investment approach, how much he's invested, how well he's done, and so forth. So let's dive into it. Okay, so I've got some notes here, so just bear with me, but I want to hit some highlights. So one, he's invested in 56 companies. 38 of those are still in operation, 69%, which is frankly better than the rest of the sharks. He's only lost 17 deals, which represent about 31%, and he's generated about 6 exits. That's pretty good, especially compared to a lot of the other sharks. He's right there in terms of total number of deals. I think he's the second most prolific shark, and definitely has the best track record in terms of investing in companies that are still alive, which is pretty good. His best investments include companies like Cinnaholic, Jump Forward, and Tipsy Elves. He's generated anywhere from an 18x to 120x based on my calculations and estimates. Another interesting thing about Robert's portfolio is that a whopping 26, or almost half, of his total investments have seen an increase in valuation from the time he invested, which means that the revenue is growing and they're doing well, and well enough that there's a strong argument that the company should be worth more than what he paid for it. And that is an order of magnitude better than the other sharks. When I think about it though, he doesn't have like the huge outliers. Don't get me wrong, like 120x return on an investment is really good and is better than, what Kevin O'Leary has in his portfolio. But the flip side is that he hasn't generated a lot of cash returns. And even though like his businesses are doing okay, there are very few that are like really absolutely crushing it and growing really fast. It's almost like he's really good at investing in lifestyle businesses to be, supportive of the companies. Which, don't get me wrong, is totally fine. But I have this like red flag in my mind of whether or not he's going to be able to generate real cash returns. Like, who's going to buy a business that's generating, less than $2 million in revenue, even if it's profitable? Like, it's just a very small world for a potential acquirers of that type of business, which means the company will either sputter along forever and maybe he gets a small dividend check every year, which I guess over time, he could generate a return on. But more likely than not, the company, the founder will get old, they'll retire, they'll decide they want to pursue other interests, and the company will ultimately fold. And that brings me to like one of the biggest challenges with most Shark Tank pitches that I see. And that is most of these companies, well, they're doing something kind of interesting. I always just wonder, like, how are they going to get to a liquidity event? How are they going to get big enough that somebody will want to acquire them or that they'll be able to go public? And the reality is, I think that most, and that's really what the data is proving out now that I've done these deep dives on each of their track records, is that most of these companies won't ever make it. In fact, right now, most of the sharks have lost about 50% of the companies that they've invested in, and about the same amount of capital. And given kind of that ratio and hit rate, it wouldn't surprise me if when all is said and done, 75% of their investments go to zero, which I know is like kind of a downer, but that is just also kind of how investing in startups work. What do they say? 9 times out of 10, a startup's going to fail. So, the fact that you're 1 out of 4 is going to succeed is a lot better than 1 out of 10. So maybe it's not so bad. The other thing that I thought was interesting about Robert is that 60% of his deals, he partners with somebody else. Now, if you've watched my video on Mr. Wonderful, you'll know that like he also does a bunch of deals with other partners. And I think it's interesting that they both do a lot of deals with their partners, their colleagues, because they definitely have very different temperaments. I feel like Robert should be called Mr. Wholesome because he's always like so nice and he just like has this like pleasant demeanor and he like wants to be supportive and all of those things. And so when he comes to a deal, it's almost like he's like this really great partner that everyone like, yeah, I'd love to partner with you, Robert. That sounds great. And he's closed, 56 deals, which is the second highest. So, it seems like entrepreneurs genuinely like working with him, which, that's another thing that always kind of surprised me because Robert made his money in software. Like he doesn't have the like consumer products, experience, connections, etc. that some of his peers do in the Shark Tank. And so I've always just like wondered, like scratched my head why entrepreneurs would want to work with him when, it's not clear how much value he can really bring. Not to say that he can't bring any, but on a comparative basis, it seems like Lori or Barbara or Mr. Wonderful even like could bring more value through their connections. And yet entrepreneurs seem to really like working with him, as do the other sharks. And if you're an aspiring venture investor, I think like Robert is a really good role model of somebody who is able to get deals done and build relationships and partnerships and be a good partner. And there's a ton of value there. In fact, it's, brought a ton of value in that he's been able to invest in companies like Cinnaholic, which has done incredibly well. When he invested, the company had one location. They'd come to the Sharks asking for some money so they could open a second location. Today, they have over 70 locations. And they have another like 20 some odd planned. They've moved to a franchise model that's going gangbusters and doing really well. And they're totally riding this wave of people that are looking for a vegan alternative for sweet treats like Cinnabons. And they're doing really well. Based on my estimates, that investment alone, which was a $200,000 investment for Robert, could be worth upwards of $24 million today. So, which is a phenomenal return. And easily returns all of the cash that he's already invested into these companies. The other interesting thing about our dear friend Robert is he is also the most generous investor when it comes to deploying capital. Now, part of that is because he did one deal where he invested $5 million, which, the startup graveyard is full of electric car companies because they're just so hard to build. They're so capital intensive. He owns half the business. So, I don't know how that one's going to pan out. It hasn't been doing particularly well based on what I could see, which could be a pretty sizable hit. But even then, that still leaves him with over $10 million of other investments, which is significantly more than the other sharks. If you include his total invested capital, including that $5 million investment, that's 3 times what Mr. Wonderful has invested and twice what Barbara and Damon have invested. So he writes, big checks, like he gets excited. And you can see that because his average investment's about $300,000, whereas median is about $100,000. So what that means is half of his investments are $100,000 or less, but on average, he's writing $300,000 checks, which to me says like when Robert gets excited, he's willing to like pull out the checkbook and write a big check. The other interesting thing, like I mentioned earlier though, is despite the fact that he's deploying a lot of capital, he's only lost 16% of his businesses so far, which could be a number of things. One, it could be that he's just really good at picking great companies. It could also be that he's willing to write a bigger check and bring more value to the table by partnering with other investors to help the company. And that's a very common thing you see in venture investing. It's, most venture capitalists think about other venture capital funds as like frenemies. We're all like trying to get the best returns we can and get as much into the very best deals as we can. But at the same time, very few funds are willing to risk everything on one company. And so we like coming in alongside other venture investors for a number of reasons. One, you don't have to put as much money into the company to support them. And two, you're able to rely on those other investors to help the company succeed, whether it's in times that are times of plenty or times of famine. You've got other people around the table that are willing to roll up their sleeves and help, which can be like a game changer when it comes to the success or failure of a startup. And so it wouldn't surprise me if you're seeing a similar dynamic play out here, where Robert leans in, writes larger checks, gives companies more runway so that they can be successful ultimately, or at least not fail. And then he brings more partners around the table to really help the company succeed and get, there's no reason why a company can't tap into the resources of several of the sharks, right? And get a ton more value than just from one shark. Now, there is a concept called party rounds. There is an element of like when everybody piles in, those are some of the worst deals. And I think that's because none of the investors really take ownership over it. But when you've got like one or two other sharks in the deal, I think that's where you start to see some magic happen. The other thing that happens too, though, is if you look at Barbara's track record, you look at Damon's track record, the times where they've done the best are when they had high conviction and did it alone. And those were probably like highly controversial investments, right? A bunch of the sharks were like, oh, you're going to totally lose all your money. But they had high conviction and leaned in and ended up doing phenomenally well. And that totally happens in venture as well. There's a bit of a joke that, the best investments are the ones that are the most divisive. Because if it were obvious and everybody thought it was going to be successful, then it's like so obvious that there's probably lots of competitors, the valuation's too high, et cetera, and so you end up not doing quite as well on those. My impression with Robert is that, look, he's sold his company, he's on the show. I think he's just having a good time. He's invested more of his net worth than any of the other sharks. I've estimated that he's invested roughly 7 to 8% of his total net worth into companies that have come on the show. Which is 3 to 4 times higher than the other sharks. And so, I look at it though as he probably really enjoys this. He probably enjoys working with entrepreneurs, helping them succeed. And, that's kind of paying off where he's not seeing as many losses as some of his peers. And he's, getting into some interesting deals. The big question for Robert is whether or not he can get to an exit. What he needs to figure out is how can he be a little bit more like Mr. Wonderful so that he can drive real cash returns. Because to date, he's only returned about 50 cents on every dollar he's invested. Which, don't get me wrong, that's not so bad because he's got a lot of other bullets in the portfolio, if you will, companies that are doing really well. Which, compared to Mr. Wonderful, who's returned $2.70 for every dollar invested, he's got a long way to catch up. And so that's the big question for Robert. How do you either figure out how to get a better deal where you're generating more cash, or how do you help your companies get to a liquidity event rather than just, slow grow on revenue? Anyways, what do you think? Who's your favorite shark? Who would you want to take money from? Throw it down in the comments below. Love to hear what you guys think. And if you haven't checked out some of my other Shark Tank videos, especially those where I do a deep dive, be sure to check out Mr. Wonderful. I've referenced him a ton in this video. His track record is super interesting and surprised me in a lot of ways that I think you'll find fun. Thanks.